Welcome, everyone. My name is Brian Burns, and I will be helping facilitate today's webinar, The Next Frontier, Innovation in Real-World Evidence, Determine, Demonstrate, and Communicate Your Value. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. If you are not on Chrome or Firefox, sign out and sign back in now using one of those browsers to avoid any technical issues. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, press F5 or refresh your browser, or post in the Q&A. We do have technical support standing by to help. We also plan to have time at the end of the webinar to answer questions, so please do feel free to include your questions in that Q&A window. If we don't get to your questions or we don't get to questions at all, we'll be sure that the appropriate speaker follows up with you after the webinar. And lastly, at the very end of the webinar, we do have a short survey, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback on today's session. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We are very excited to have two guest speakers joining the IQVIA team today. Dr. Ivo Abraham is a professor at the University of Arizona, where he is affiliated with the Center for Health Outcomes and Pharmacoeconomic Research and with its Cancer Center. For the past 40+ years, his research has ranged from molecules and models of care, patients to populations, and empirics to evidence and economics. And this across North and South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Oceania. Following 3 years as Deputy Editor-in-Chief, he has been Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Medical Economics since 2022. Dr. Mikkel Hilligsman is Associate Professor in Health Economics and Health Technology Assessment at Maastricht University. He has more than 15 years of experience in health economic evaluation and preference research, and has published more than 250 scientific papers. Since January 2023, he is the Editor-in-Chief of Expert Review of Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research. From the IQVIA team, we're joined by Dr. Chi-Cheng Chen. He is a senior principal with IQVIA US Medical and Scientific Services. He is trained as a pharmacist and epidemiologist and has been conducting outcomes research for almost 20 years in government, academic, and industry settings. Dr. Chen's primary area of expertise is designing and conducting innovative retrospective database studies to provide real-world evidence for health technologies. And we're also joined by Amy Neer, Senior Principal with IQVIA's US Medical and Scientific Services team. She has over 14 years of experience gained working with CROs, HEOR consulting, academia, and the nonprofit sector. Her expertise in observational research study design spans a variety of therapeutic areas with considerable expertise in oncology, health economics, and outcomes research. She has published her research in well-known peer-reviewed medical journals and presented at numerous scientific conferences. And with that, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Abraham.
For that introduction. Pleasure to be here, part of this webinar. I will also like to tell you or communicate to you that there is another Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Medical Economics, my colleague Kenneth Lee at Taylor's University in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. So it's really a team of two, along with Mike Gregg, the executive editor, that is growing the journal, and that is something I would like to tell you more about. The Journal of Medical Economics, first of all, is a global journal. It's not a US journal, it's not a UK journal, it's a global journal. We publish papers from all over the world. And you see that also in the list there. That's actually based upon an article that summarized the number of papers that were published in various countries, or compared various countries, or analyzed issues in certain regions of the world. You also see on the left the focus of the journal. Really what the journal tries to do is answer 5 questions. What is the need? What is the burden of illness, for instance? What do we have in terms of treatments, diagnostics? How much does it cost? Is it worth it? And can we afford it? Those 5 questions are critical to evaluate from a perspective of economics, from an economic perspective, the treatments, the diagnostic technologies, the digital health technologies that we may have at our disposition that have been developed, and whether those should be deployed and how to deploy them and how to finance all of that. This then feeds secondarily into a need for further health policy analysis and health policy discussions, but also a challenge, especially now with some developments in the US legislatively, but also in other parts of the world, innovation in methods and in methodology for health economics. The journal is committed to rare diseases. Now, rare diseases are very challenging, my apologies, topic in economic evaluation because the market is very limited and often the treatments are very expensive. So we need to think, and that is illustrated in the paper that you see there cited at the bottom, we need to think about different ways of valuing potential new treatments for rare diseases, and the paper that you see listed there pertains to cystic fibrosis, where a few years ago, finally, we had an enormous breakthrough, a very expensive breakthrough, but an enormous breakthrough that can cure more than 90% of patients, children predominantly, with cystic fibrosis. We're also committed to real-world data. And with real-world data, we're not talking necessarily about the source. Yes, there's different sources of real-world data, but we're talking about treatment patterns or diagnostic patterns, other patterns of doing certain things for patients. And let's call it treatment patterns and the variability in treatment patterns, and then the outcomes and the variability in outcomes that we observe. That is important because mostly, certainly for treatments, for drugs, we rely initially on clinical trials. That's all the evidence that we have. But once these treatments are adopted in the real world, you see variation that is sometimes quite different from what we have in the trial. Quite different for the better, for the worse. Here, an example of an area of also great progress, and that is with regard to multiple sclerosis, and a paper that we published in that regard. And then all the progress in oncology, we also want to capture from an economic point of view. But if you really start thinking about oncology, you start thinking, or you're confronted with the reality of very expensive treatments, especially the biological ones, but even some of the advanced small molecule treatments. So we have that as a first issue, that suddenly all these metrics that we may have been using of what is an appropriate willingness to pay threshold, it goes out of the window. So we need to think here about new ways of valuing the treatments for cancers, not only individual treatments, but also, since a lot of cancer patients go through multiple lines of treatments, what are the trajectories of treatments, and is it worth it, and can we afford it? Paper there on the left related to projecting out survival outcomes, for instance, and methodological aspects by a group headed by Miranda Cooper. And then on the right-hand side, a recent paper that was published, initiated by the International Myeloma Foundation, about economic models to evaluate, again, these 5 questions, but especially the last 2 ones. Is it worth it? Can we afford it in the space of multiple myeloma? Here, we kind of put together buzzwords that you will find in our articles, more as a way of also showing the emphasis, the relative emphasis. You see patients in big letters there. Ultimately, we are not doing economics for the sake of dollars or pounds or euros or whatever unit of currency. We are evaluating the worthiness and the affordability of treatments ultimately to help patients. Some trending topics that I would like to highlight. First of all, biosimilars. You can say biosimilars, what is exciting about that? It's new formulations of old drugs. Well, these old drugs have served the purpose. They're still serving the purpose, but they're also, because of all the real world evidence that has accrued over the years, sometimes even solidly over a decade, 2 decades, it also has generated new questions. Another aspect with biosimilars is starting, and that's no rocket science here, if something is cheaper than something else, you're going to have savings. Now, what can we do as a responsible society, especially from a payer perspective? What can we do with these savings? Now, we could put in just general treasury, so to speak, and yes, we have saved money, or we can start looking at how biosimilar conversion, using biosimilars as opposed to the originator product, the reference product, how that generates savings that we could provide on a budget neutral basis, expanded access to treatments, whether it's more patients getting, in this case, prophylaxis for febrile neutropenia prior to undergoing myelotoxic chemotherapy, or whether it is being able to treat more patients with novel treatments, still very expensive treatments, so in a way subsidizing some of the very expensive treatments for more patients, as was done in this particular study in Saudi Arabia, in terms of providing expanded access to women with HER2 positive breast cancer, and do that in a way of, or in a budget neutral way that does not require additional financial outlays. So that's one trending topic. Another trending topic, obviously, even though officially the pandemic is declared over, we're now in the endemic phase, COVID-19 vaccines. And the journal was among the first to really publish some of the key economic evaluations. This first one is out of Bill Padula's group. And you see here, first of all, methodologically, this was very well conducted study. So even though it was early on in the pandemic, but they adopted what we call an SEIRT, susceptible, exposed, infected, recovered, or death. So all the possible scenarios in a dynamic model. So there's also an innovation factor here that we try to embed in the journal, and that is, what are some alternative methods or required methods, considering we're talking about infectious diseases, need for vaccination. The important thing, the finding was either we can do nothing, as some voices still advocate, not vaccinate, or we can implement a policy of vaccination. And you see it there, the program cost of vaccination was estimated at that time at 13 billion. Doing nothing would have cost 20 billion more, 33, 34 billion, almost 21 billion. So a very significant budget impact, negative budget impact in terms of not vaccinating, not having a vaccination policy. If we then continue within COVID-19, and a later paper also coming from a very strong group, I was very privileged to be able to publish this paper as well from this group led by Dr. De Fusco. Here too, you see again that methodology of susceptible, infected, recovered, death, but also a decision-making process. And I'll get to that in a second. But also what was very nice is, okay, this paper was published earlier this year. So it was able to capture 3 of the vaccines. We're up to 6 possible for people over the age of 65, or risk factors can now get their 6th vaccination, boosters included, etc. Here, at least we captured that first generation that was full primary vaccination, then with the 2 boosters. What was also very interesting about this paper, very innovative about this paper, is that it had this decision tree embedded in it, and also considered, and I want to emphasize this, if you go all the way to the right, considering whether patients might be at risk of long COVID or no long COVID. This syndrome that we're trying to get a handle on that we're only now beginning to halfway understand, but that we need to be prepared from a public health perspective to address. Then finally, I would like to emphasize that the journal also wants to take things to the next level, especially with a commitment, as you see from the two papers that we have here, to affordability of treatments and preparedness for the future in low and middle income countries. We had a very interesting paper on the Global South, consider everything under the equator, and from a low and middle income country, take out Australia and New Zealand, and you have a very significant proportion of the world population that lives in the Global South. And how can we assure access to treatments, and how can we also evaluate in time the effectiveness of access to these treatments? And the other paper was related to India. As you may know, it's now the most populous country in the world, and the concern of a currently very young population at some point in time aging as well, with longer longevity for the current generations, younger generations, and how India will need to prepare for that future. Looking forward, finally, lastly, artificial intelligence special issue will be coming up. Pandemics, epidemics, and endemics. We will continue to emphasize the areas and the 5 questions that I highlighted earlier. And because the days of the QALY may be relatively numbered, we also need to think about, and we will publish papers on alternate and novel metrics of value and affordability. With that, thank you very much, and I would like to hand it over now to my colleague, Michael Hillitsman, Editor-in-Chief of Expert Review of Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research.
Many thanks, Ivo, for your great presentation. And now it's my pleasure to present you another Taylor and Francis Group journal called Expert Review of Pharmacoeconomics and Outcome Research. And as previously mentioned, I have the pleasure to be the editor-in-chief of the journal since January 2023. Just for some information regarding the journal. The journal is also an international journal publishing peer review and original article regarding health economics, pharmacoeconomics, and outcomes regarding to all health technologies ranging from drugs, therapeutic approaches, medical device, and also preventions. And just some journal metrics. Last year, about 200,000 annual downloads and views of our papers. Our impact factor is just above 2.0, 33 days on average between submission to the first decision, 12 days between acceptance and online publication, and we have an acceptance rate of 38%. The article included in our journal focus on health technology assessment is on the broad field of HTA, the multidisciplinary field to really assess the value of health technologies and to really aim policymakers to efficiently allocate healthcare resources with a focus on health economics as a part and a pillar of HTA, really looking at the economic value of health technology. In particular, we publish several health economic evaluations, such as cost effectiveness or cost utility analysis of different health technologies, including drugs. That's why we also have pharmacoeconomics in our title, but also studies looking at the affordability of healthcare innovation, such as budget impact analysis. We also cover outcome research, including therapeutic outcomes, patient-related outcomes, but also health preference research, by example. We are also interested in quality of life studies, in economic burden, the burden of diseases, including cost of illness. And as the Journal of Medical Economics, we also cover national and international topics, articles from different countries for a really global research. We publish different types of articles, original reviews, and it's not only reviews and systematic review. Original research are also type of article we are receiving and nowadays more and more, but we also include reviews, systematic reviews, meta-analysis, but also other type of articles such as editorials. And this is a nice picture of our journal. What I now would like to do in the next minute is to present you some emerging themes. I also would like to clarify, it's not a full overview of the journal, because as mentioned in the previous slide, we are really looking broadly in the field of HTA, economic evaluation, outcome research, but I would like to highlight some of the emerging themes, and for each of them to present one related paper that was recently published. It's also not an exhaustive list of emerging themes, it's just some of the themes that we see they are increasing in our journal. And the first of them is quality of life. And we really see on this figure a really increasing number of papers that looks at quality of life. The next one is the caregiver. Before 2018, there was no paper regarding the burden or the economic evaluation of caregivers. And we see a trend, an increasing importance, especially in 2022, of studies also reporting the burden of healthcare for caregivers. Another theme is methodology in cost. That will also be introduced with one paper. Another one is payment models. And we also see now that every year we publish some articles regarding payment models. And finally, the last emerging theme is social determinants, where we also see an increasing interest in our journal. And this last theme will be later also presented by a speaker of IQVIA with one study. And now I will focus on the four first emerging theme and showing an example of paper that we publish in our journal. And regarding the quality of life themes, I will briefly introduce one paper that was entitled The Assessment of the Quality of Life, 8 Dimensions, Translation, Validation, and Application in 2 Dutch trials in patients with epilepsy and schizophrenia. And looking a bit more in this paper, typically we use generic instruments, generic quality of life instruments, such as the IQVIA or the SF60, but this instrument may be inadequate for certain mental health conditions because they do not include a lot of dimensions regarding the mental health states of the patient. And recently, the ACOL 8D, that includes 8 dimensions: independent living, happiness, mental health, coping, relationships, self-worth, pain, and senses, was developed. But the tool was not yet developed and validated in Dutch. And there was also no assessment of the psychometric properties of this tool compared to the well-known and commonly used AQ5D5L questionnaire. And thus this studies really aims to assess this questionnaire, to translate in Dutch, but also to apply it into Dutch clinical trials. And the studies found that the tool showed higher responsiveness compared to AQ5D5L in patients with schizophrenia, showing that the instrument could be more appropriate. And while both instruments show equal responsiveness in patients with epilepsy. And thus this paper highly recommend the use of this questionnaire in addition to AQ5D5L, which still also remain important in trial assessing the patient quality of life in patients with epilepsy or schizophrenia. Looking at another theme, the next theme was the caregiver cost. And I would like to briefly present a paper, a review paper of the caregiver cost included in cost of illness studies from a team in the US. And most economic evaluation, most economic burden studies, they typically only focus on patient cost. But this may underestimate the real burden resulting from these diseases. Because some diseases, just think about dementia, stroke, cancer, by example, or another very good example are pediatric diseases, where the burden of patient is important, but also the burden of the caregivers. if, for example, a child is ill, the burden for the parents, for the caregivers could be very, very important. And often these costs are not included in cost of illness studies. This interesting paper reviews all of the papers that estimated the caregiver cost in cost of illness studies. And this review identified 51 studies with a wide range of the estimates, ranging from just $30 to more than $86,000. It was in the field of pediatric disease. And the studies also found that most studies estimated only the caregiver time cost, and not a lot of studies really reported the productivity or other type of cost. But this paper clearly shows the potential importance of caregiver costs that should just be measured and included in future economic evaluation. And this study also highlights the lack of definition regarding the caregiver cost and how to measure caregiver. Because we also need more guidelines in the future regarding the definition and how we could measure caregiver cost. The next theme is the cost methodology, and I would like to briefly introduce a paper resulting from a large European project showing the international comparability of reference unit costs for education services. And health problem can lead to cost not only for caregiver, but also education sector, because if a child is unable to go to school, this can lead to substantial costs. But this type of cost, because in education sector, are also rarely included in health economic evaluation. And one of the main reasons is the lack of reference unit cost. What is the cost of missing one day at school? And often this information is not provided. And this paper, based on the IQVIA project, provided some reference unit cost for different services that you can also see on this table, where you see really what is the price for missing one day at school in a various number of countries. And this data could be really useful for people in the future to include education costs in economic evaluation. And the final paper I would like to introduce is a paper entitled Medicaid Best Price Reforms to Enable Innovative Payment Models for Cell and Gene Therapies. And it's a paper did by people in the US. And we all know that cell and gene therapies, they provide high benefit, but they are also really expensive. So there are some financial challenges. And value-based purchasing arrangement can address such uncertainty, but they have been inhibited in the US by the Medicaid drug rebate program. And this paper really examined the likely effectiveness of the Medicaid drug rebate program enabling this value-based purchasing arrangement. They show that they could be useful, but there are still some challenges with operational cost. And the key messages also from this paper is that further reform may be needed to really extend this type of value-based arrangement to other type of drugs. Some future trends that we expect in our journal will be linked to the special issue. We have one special issue on digital health, and especially how can digital endpoints empower patients. So we expect to have a lot of papers around this field. And another topic, another special issue that will be open in the next few weeks will be regarding medication adherence. That has a lot of consequences for patients, and we will look into research and innovation in medication adherence. Some other trends that we expect to see in the future is regarding preference research, because it's nowadays more and more important to elicit patient preferences. Also regarding equity, because efficiency is important, but equity is also something really important. Prevention is also becoming more and more important, because the economics and prevention will definitely be a future trend. And also we see, and we already see more and more papers on real-world evidence that will definitely be another trend in the future. I thank you for your attention, and now I will give the floor to our next speaker.
Great. Thank you, Mikkel. Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Muir, and I am a senior principal at IQVIA, and I'm here today with my colleague, Chi Chang, and we are going to walk you through several case studies that are going to highlight some of the themes and emerging trends that you just heard about. So my first two case studies are going to touch on the emerging trend that Mikkel just mentioned of medication adherence, but they're going to look at it through a different lens. Our first case study is going to touch on the importance of getting patients the medications that they need that are intended to them and that they have prescriptions for. So in this case study, we focused on a cohort of patients with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder who received their first prescription for a long-acting injectable antipsychotic. And it's well known that there are significant barriers to getting patients the medications that are intended for them. Those barriers come in a number of different forms, and that makes it a very complex, challenging issue. In this case study, we focused on the barriers of payer rejection. So payers reject the claim for a number of reasons, including formulary restrictions, claim reversal. So this is kind of a proxy for patient primary non-adherence. The patient did not pick up a medication claim that was approved by the payer, and they didn't pick it up within a certain period of time. So in this project, we wanted to look at the impact of the initial claim status, so payer rejected claim, a claim that was reversed, so not picked up by the patient, or a paid claim, meaning the patient picked up their long-acting injectable antipsychotic and we're assuming that they took it as intended. We want to look at the impact of that initial claim status on subsequent disease-related healthcare resource use, which is kind of a proxy for disease-related disease management and healthcare outcomes. And overall, we also wanted to get a sense of how significant is payer rejection and claim reversal in this population? How frequent is it? So in order to conduct this study, we linked together a number of unique existing databases. Our backbone database was IQVIA's Formulary Impact Analyzer Database, or FIA. This is a really unique database, and it not only provides paid claims, but it also provides rejected and reversed claims. So you can really see the life cycle of the claim in this database. This database allowed us to create our 3 study cohorts of interest, our patients who had their initial medication claim rejected, patients who had it reversed because they didn't pick it up, or patients who had their first claim paid. This was our cohort that you picked up their medication. As I said, we assume that they took it as intended. So in order to get a more comprehensive picture of patients' other healthcare resource use and patient demographics, clinical characteristics, and so on, we linked to 3 other databases. We linked to IQVIA's Open Medical Claims, our DX database. We linked to our charge detail master hospital claims data, refer to it as CDM, and this allowed us to look for our outcome of disease-related hospitalizations in the follow-up period. And then lastly, as you heard, social determinants of health are very important to consider, particularly when you're looking at barriers of care. In this case, to capture social determinants of health and patient socioeconomic characteristics, we linked to the Experian consumer database. So we pulled in patient information on patient annual income, race, ethnicity, education level, and several different characteristics. So after we created our study database, we dove into comparing the outcomes between our 3 different study cohorts. And first of all, we found that a very large number of patients had their initial claim rejected or reversed. About 1/3 of patients had their first claim for the long-acting injectable antipsychotic rejected by payers, and 26% had their first claim reversed. So that's over 50% of patients who were supposed to receive a certain medication who did not receive it due to the barrier of payer rejection or claim reversal. Furthermore, only half of these patients actually went on to have a subsequent paid claim for that medication during the follow-up period. Now, we looked at the time to that first paid claim among the cohort of patients who did go on to eventually receive that medication. This gave us a sense of delays in treatment and gaps in treatment. We found a median of 11 days for the time to first paid claim for patients whose initial claim was reversed. And then we found a median of 22 days to the first paid claim for patients who had an initial rejection. Lastly, we wanted to look at the impact of that initial claim status on subsequent disease management. and healthcare resource utilization. And we did this by looking at disease-related hospitalizations in the immediate 6 months after that initial claim. We found that patients who had their initial claim for this medication reversed had a 40% higher odds of disease-related hospitalization in that 6-month follow-up period. So this study just highlights the significant impact that barriers to care have on patients in terms of their disease outcomes, and also just the frequency, the high frequency of these barriers to care, and the importance of minimizing and mitigating these barriers to ultimately improve patient medication primary adherence, fulfillment, and ultimately disease outcomes. Now, my next case study, we're going to shift gears and look at adherence and persistence through the lens of these patients have the medications in hand. Are they taking them as they're supposed to and for the right amount of time? In this case, we evaluated the impact of a patient support program. So there are many patient support programs that are available to patients. These support programs provide support in a number of different ways. They can provide financial support, copay assistance, educational support for patients to understand their disease, understand their medication. And these programs can also provide support to patients for actually taking their medication and helping them get comfortable taking medications. For example, medications that require that they inject a medication on their own. In this case, we were evaluating the impact of a patient support program that was for patients that have rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, or AS, and were newly being treated with a TNF inhibitor therapy. And we wanted to understand the impact of a patient support program that provided live nurse telehealth support to these patients. So these patients could call in to get support on just understanding their medication, understanding their disease, also help with administering their medication and getting comfortable administering their medication, which was an injectable. So in order to look at the impact of the program and look at the value of the program, we linked together several databases. We had a database with patients that were in the support program, and we linked that to IQVIA's longitudinal prescription database and our open medical claims database. And through the linkage of these databases, we were able to grade our 2 study cohorts. We had our case cohort, which is patients that were in the support program, and we had our control cohort, patients who were not in the program. They did not have evidence of program participation during the study period. Now, in observational research, we all know it's very important to balance those cohorts to make sure that they look as similar as possible when doing any comparative analyses, so that the only real difference that remains is if they were in the program or not. So in order to balance our cohorts, we did 1-to-1 propensity score matching based on patient baseline demographic and clinical characteristics. So we had information on their disease history, treatment patterns, etc. So you can see our results on the right. Overall, we did see value in this program. Patients that were in the support program had almost 25% lower chance of discontinuing their TNF inhibitor therapy during the 12-month follow-up period compared to their matched controls. So I love this study because it really highlights, first of all, the importance of evaluating these programs and making sure that they are providing the impact that they're intended to and really helping patients, and then communicating that value. So getting this, information to physicians and other caregivers to hopefully, enhance support program participation for patients that will benefit. And lastly, this case study is going to touch on the theme of rare diseases. We're all aware, and we heard from Ivo, that patients with rare diseases are very challenging to study for a number of reasons. First of all, as we know, they're rare diseases. There are not a lot of patients. It's hard to build a cohort in existing data of patients that will be robust and well-powered for analyses. But taking a step back, it's also very difficult and sometimes not possible to identify these patients in existing data. And this case study is going to highlight one initiative that we took at IQVIA to identify patients who did not have a specific diagnosis code for their disease. So it was not possible to identify these patients from the ICD-10 diagnosis code. And in order to take on this challenge, IQVIA partnered with the Rare Disease Patient Advocacy Group. And this group was able to give a list of their members. So that was 121 patients who have the disease. So these are confirmed positive patients, which we were not able to identify in the existing data. So with this list, IQVIA deployed our tokenization engine to the advocacy group membership list. So this removed all patient identifiers, so patient first name, last name, gender, date of birth, zip code, etc. So essentially stripping the membership list of any identifiable information and providing each patient a unique token. So that unique token, we then could see is that token in the universe of IQVIA data. So we were looking at the match rate with IQVIA data so we could try to identify these patients in existing data. In fact, we found 98% linkage between the membership list from the advocacy group and the universe of IQVIA data. Now, I keep saying the universe of IQVIA data, and that this includes EMR data, it includes a number of different claims data. So really, we were just confirming that these patient tokens were found in at least one of these databases. Now, when we drill down a little bit further, we found about 80% linkage to open claims, which you heard about in the prior case study, and we found about 20% linkage to closed claims. So this was a great, innovative, fast approach to identifying the right patients in real-world data, and this sets the stage for subsequent analyses to look at disease burden and to really show the unmet need and the diagnostic journey and the treatment journey of these patients. So now I will pass it to Ji-Chang.
Thank you, Amy. Again, this is Ji-Chang Chen. I'm a senior principal with U.S. Medical and Scientific Services. So I'm going to take the next 10 minutes also to go through a few case studies along with the themes that the prior presenters has presented. And so the first one will be related to the predictive analytics, and second and third one will be related to social determinant of health. So this first one here, as you can see, is in the disease area of relapsed refractory acute myeloid leukemia in the United States. So the little bit background here, we all know that claims data, is the non-limitation that we do not have detailed resource use during hospitalization due to DRG or global payment system. So usually what you get is a lump sum number. And then this really creates a challenge, right? When you are only interested in a specific resource utilization, such as in this study, we're only interested in knowing the burden directly related to the chemotherapy and the adverse event AE in the chemotherapy hospitalization. Right? We are not really interested for this specific study, those related maybe to the disease itself or other things. So to address this, the study team implemented an innovative approach. And so in the phase one, we utilize IQVIA hospital charge data master file, or the CDM data mentioned earlier, which has the detailed 9-item hospital charges or resource use. And that really allows us to pick out those related to chemotherapy and AE and those that's not. And then in turn, this really allows us to predict or estimate the proportion that's related to chemo and AE, right? So in a given hospitalization, chemo hospitalization in AML patients. So method-wise, we divided the CDM sample into training set and validation set. And in the training set, we use the HGB or extreme gradient boosting model to predict the proportion of overall hospital charges directly related to chemo and AE. And then this model was validated in the CDM validation set. So that's phase one. And then in phase two, what we did is that we took this model to the backbone study base, or the main study base, which is the IQVIA Pharmacy Plus claims database, and apply this algorithm to each and every chemo hospitalization observed there, using the features or the variables that observed in the given hospitalization, and then estimate and adjust the cost associated with chemo and or AE. So moving on to the results, the HGB model included in the end 48 clinical and demographic features available in both CDM and the Pharmacy Plus database. And as you can see on the right side here, the predicted mean ratio of total cost attributable to chemo and AE was about 69% for HIC or high intensity chemotherapy hospitalization. For non-HIC, it was actually much lower. The ratio was much lower, or the discount was much higher. The ratio was about 40%. So as you can see, one of the key results here is that the unadjusted mean chemotherapy hospitalization cost was originally $166,000 per episode, but then after the adjustment, the mean decreased to only about 61,000. So this approach, with this approach, we were able to refine the burden of chemotherapy estimates by developing an algorithm in a separate database that has more detail that allow you to develop algorithm, but then apply it to the main study base, and to address limitation where originally it could only be included as a limitation, but then we were able to refine it. You can see here the degree of difference is quite significant. So now I'm going to my next case study, which this one and the next one will be focusing on the social determinant of health. So this second one is relatively straightforward virtual outcome study, but again, just highlights the impact of including social determinant of health, or SDOH, specifically here, race ethnicity, to help improve health equity. So the objectives of this study were to estimate recombinant herpes zoster or RZV vaccine completion rates and adherence with the recommended administration schedule, and also to evaluate the factors impacting completion rates. The study team leveraged 3 linked data assets, IQVIA data assets, the IQVIA pharmacy and medical claims, as well as the experience consumer data to obtain race and ethnicity information. So for this specific one, and also the next one as well, we use the experience consumer data, but IQVIA does have access to quite a few SDOH data assets or data sources. Some of them are proprietary, some of them are publicly available, but we are able to link all of them to IQVIA data assets either through a patient token or through geocoding. So back to this study, the method was the completion rates and adherence was reported descriptively by either the pharmacy or the medical setting, and then also by age, by gender, race, ethnicity, and the pair type. And then we use logistic regression to conduct, to identify the factors associated with the outcomes in a couple of subpopulations of interest. So onto the key findings. Overall, the completion rate was about 70% at 6 months. Again, this is a 2-dose vaccine series. The completion rate was 70% at 6 months and 82% at 12 months. But as you can see here, it's higher in the pharmacy setting compared to the medical setting. And then more important is that we identify a few subpopulations were associated with lower completion rates. There are Medicaid patients, adults with chronic disease, as well as African American. So to really study up, or prior studies have shown that race, ethnicity, income, and other SDOH variables were among the factors impacting the RZV initiation rates. The finding of this study further indicated that African Americans likely will be among other populations have associated with lower completion rate. This really can help inform that future strategies, policies such as population to target or outreach for patient support program would kind of feed information into that initiatives. And now I'll go to my last case study, and I really like this one as it look at the complex relationship between race and ethnicity, income, these social determinant of health variables, and how they related to copay assistance, and then how copay assistance impact the prescription abandonment. And this one really demonstrated how some of these non-clinical factors, right, the social determinant of health factors, was patient supportive program like copay assistance, that can impact patient behavior as well as potentially patient the treatment outcomes as well. And this study was just published earlier in this year in JMCB, and it was conducted by my colleague Jason Yao and other authors. So the study team carried out a pool cross-sectional study that utilized IQVIA law database, which basically is a combination of the open source claims on the pharmacy side and the open source claim on the medical side, as well as prescription life cycle data, as Amy mentioned, the FIA data that we have that allow us to know whether a prescription was approved or rejected. And then link that to the consumer data for the race, ethnicity, and income, and then as you can see, some of the definition here, the copay assistance was defined as use of copay or discount cards or free trial vouchers. And then the prescription abandonment was defined as the plan, approve the request of the prescription, but the patient did not fill the prescription within 30 days. So this study also utilized logistic regressions to evaluate copay assistance use, prescription abandonment across these social determinant of health levels, as well as the role of copay assistance use on prescription abandonment. Moving on to the results, as you can see here, a few subpopulations: African Americans, Hispanic, and those with household income less than 50,000 were associated with higher RA prescription abandonment. The odds ratio ranged from 1.11 to 1.17. And interestingly, no racial or ethnic differences were observed for oral oncology medications among those who did not use the copay assistance. But the income, right, those with household income less than 50,000 was still observed to be more likely to abandon their prescription, their oncology prescriptions. So that's the onto the impact of copay assistance. As you can see here, the copay assistance really helped lower prescription abandonment in both RA and oral oncology medication. 78% lower for RA prescriptions and 71% lower for oral oncolytic medications. And this effect was similar across race, ethnicity, or income levels. So this study not only showed some disparity, right, by race, ethnicity, and income level, but also generated evidence that copay assistance is an effective tool to help patients gain access to the needed medication. So we talk about a patient supportive program, and this, to evaluate that, just overall, we can also evaluate at the different SDOH level or factors. So lastly, I just want to mention that all the 3 case studies I presented here are published, and if you're interested in finding more details, you can find the citation at the bottom of each case study. And next, I think I'll turn it over to Brian, who will answer some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chi-Cheng. We do have a few questions that came in during the webinars, and it looks like we have a few minutes to answer a couple of those. A friendly reminder, you can still add your questions into the Q&A window, and if we don't have an opportunity to answer them now, we will be sure to have the speakers follow up with you after the webinar. And we'd also like to provide the presenters' contact information along with some additional context in case you would like to reach out to them directly. So first and foremost, Dr. Hilliksman, during your presentation, one of the webinar joiners asked if you have completed any health economic projects in the maternal fetal space.
Thank you for your question. So I think it's an interesting question, and personally, I have not done work in this field, but since I saw the question in the chat, I quickly went to PubMed to see if there was some work, because we could expect some work, and I was able to find a recent systematic review paper of remote fetal monitoring. And this review suggested a limited number of studies. They just identified 9 papers, but showing in several of them a reduction in some adverse outcomes, especially neonatal asphyxia, and also showing a decrease in healthcare costs compared to no intervention. But the author of this review really highlight the lack of studies, also the limited quality, and the need for further studies. I think it is definitely a field of research, and a disease field where we need more research. If the person that asked this question has any interest and opportunity to conduct research, we say feel free to reach us. But I think we need more studies in this field of research.
Thank you, Dr. Hilliksman. We probably have time for one more quick question. For the IQVIA team, either Chi-Cheng or Amy, a question came in about IQVIA's data outside the US. If you could take a moment to speak to that, as the case studies that we covered here today were more focused in the US region.
Sure, thanks, Brian. I can take that. That's a great question. We did focus our case studies on the US region, but IQVIA has many data assets around the globe. We have over 1 billion patients identified or de-identified in our data that represents, I think it's over 45 countries around the world. So while we and our team are focused on the US, we have counterparts across the globe. So if you have interests that are ex-US, feel free to reach out to us and we can share more information on our ex-US data assets.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we also help conduct multiple country studies that involve, like, say, EU, Japan, and US, and we would help coordinate that so that we have a common protocol and that kind of thing. So ensure that we do not only help to address questions with the US data to US stakeholders, but also help that in a global basis as well.
Great, thank you both. We are right about at the top of the hour and want to be sure that we are respectful of people's time. So a final thank you to all of our speakers and for all of you joining us here today for this webinar. A friendly reminder, please do take a quick minute to complete the post-webinar survey. We really do appreciate your feedback. Have a great day, everyone.